Paul is an English translator at the European Commission, turning French, Czech, Slovak, Polish, Hungarian and Estonian documents into English. Wow. He covers all policy areas, but especially energy, environment, agriculture, transport, internal market and competition. Occasionally, and more slowly, he also works with Russian, Ukrainian and German. Paul is also involved in the department's external communications work. In this talk, Paul will discuss the AI-based tools being developed by the European Commission's Directorate-General for Translation, DGT, and how they are changing the work of translators and other staff at the Commission. Paul, it's great to have you here. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. And thank you for the invitation.
It's great to have you here. So we will pass over the controls for you right away, and you may begin your presentation.
Right, I've got even more slides than Ibrahim, but I'll try and see if we can catch up time. Can you see my title slide?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So yes, thanks for inviting me. I'm going to try in this presentation to explain to you how AI has hit us as translators in the European Union institutions, and then hopefully we'll have a bit of time at the end for questions. I probably don't need to introduce the European Union to you. We're a multilingual organization of 27 countries that work with 24 official languages. Those are our 24 official languages in the language of the language. When the EU was created in 1958, we had only 4 languages, and English wasn't among them. English joined with Danish in 1973. In 2004, we had a large number of new members of the EU, which brought in 9 new official languages that we have, our translation and interpreting services have had to deal with since. And the most recent addition in terms of languages was 2013, when Croatia joined. So that's the multilingual environment that we're working in as translators in the European Union institutions. These are the rules that underpin that multilingual nature. The Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, which was the Lisbon Treaty, the rule book of the EU, says that citizens have a right to address the EU's bodies in any of the EU official languages and to receive a reply in that language. So somebody in Estonia can write to us in Estonian about whatever issue they want, and they can receive a reply in that language, and that will be important later on in the presentation. And Council Regulation number 1, 1958, the very first law that the EU adopted was about language, and it said that regulations and other documents of general application shall be drafted in the official languages. In other words, when the EU adopts a new law, it has to be published in all the languages of the EU, which is today 24. So that, of course, creates a lot of work for translators and interpreters in the EU institutions. When we talk about the EU, what we mean really is a set of these institutions that form the governing structures, the administration of this group of 27 countries. And you will have heard of the European Commission, which is where I am, and perhaps the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union. But there are several other institutions that make up these governing structures, which are more or less well known, and they each more or less have their own separate translation services. I work in the European Commission's translation service, which happens to be the biggest numerically. So I'm going to speak really from the perspective of how it looks from inside the European Commission's translation service, and actually more particularly how it looks from inside the English language department of the European Commission's translation services. But it might be a similar picture across these other EU institutions. So the European Commission's translation service, a bit of background on that. First about the European Commission. The European Commission, which we read about in the news all the time, is essentially this group of 27 people, 27, one from each member country of the EU, led by a president, which is Ursula von der Leyen at the front center there. And each of those has a different policy area um, which they deal with. And then behind them, of course, there is a large administration of civil servants who are specialists, experts dealing with that particular subject area, so covering the whole gamut of policies that the European Union is involved in. And the European Commission's Translation Service, the Directorate-General for Translation, its job is to help them with their translation needs. So they're our customers, if you like. The European Commission's role is to propose a new EU legislation. It doesn't adopt the legislation, that's the job of the European Parliament and the Council. The second job of the European Commission is to implement the budget, so spend the money, but also check that it's being spent correctly. The third main role is as the so-called guardian of the treaties. If any of the 27 member states of the European Union is not following the laws of the European Union, it's the Commission's job to take it to court, to challenge it, and to eventually take it to court. That's usually when the European Commission hits the headlines. And then finally, the Commission also represents the EU internationally. So the Directorate-General for Translation in the European Commission is to help the Commission achieve all those roles with any translation, and now more than translation services it needs. So we have, last year, we had an average of 1,944 staff. 70% of those were translators, and in this slide produced by our central communication unit, it's interesting that the second role after translator is language technology experts among our staff, and that's an indication of how language technology and AI, in fact, are becoming more and more central to the work of our translation service. But there are also more traditional roles such as quality officers, terminologists, and so on. The rest of the staff are management and support staff of various kinds. 2/3 of our staff are women. And most of our staff are based in Luxembourg, which hosts, as some of you might know, hosts a lot of EU staff. And in fact, most of the translation service is based in Luxembourg. I'm speaking to you today from an office in Brussels. I'm going to show you what we call here an organigram. I've never liked that word. I think organizational chart, I think. And the only reason I show you, it's way too complicated for a slide, but it's just to show you that the bulk of our staff on this left-hand side of the chart are our translators, and they're grouped into language departments who are based around target language. So our translators, as a rule, translate into a single target language, which is usually their native language. But on the right-hand side here, and on the next slide, I'll just expand it a little bit. As of just a few months ago, we had a so-called reconfiguration of the Commission's translation service, DG Translation, DGT, and created a technology directorate for the first time. Again, an indication of how technology is growing in importance for translation services and beyond. And then I'm not sure whether you'll be able to see it, but one of the units in that technology directorate is an AI-based services unit. And that's brand new as of a few months ago. Now, there have been people in the translation service working on AI-related tools for much longer than that. But the fact that now it has a separate named unit within our organization chart just shows how important that is becoming in the work of the European Commission and its translation service. What kind of services do we offer as a translation service to the rest of the European Commission? It's a long list, I won't go through them all, but the first one there is simply full-length translation of documents that the different policy departments of the European Commission need to have translated into whatever language they need it into. We also have a translation service that translates web pages. The Europa.eu website of the European Commission is one of the world's biggest web pages. So we have people who specialize in translating web pages. And then that third thing, e-translation. E-translation is the name of the European Commission's machine translation service. And this isn't just used by translators within the translation service. It's available for use to everybody in the European Commission. And as we'll see in a while, they do use it. In fact, it's also available outside the EU institutions as well. As well as that machine translation service, we, the translation service, offer some other AI-based services, e-briefing, e-summary, and e-reply, and I'll come to those a little bit later. And we also do various other things. I won't go into those now. But the main job is translation. Last year, we, across those just under 2,000 staff, collectively translated 2.35 million pages for our internal customers in the European Commission. About 30% of that was outsourced. And that figure has been increasing over the years. So the next slide will show, and it's quite a busy slide, but on the left-hand side here in 2012, that shows the amount of pages on this scale on the left that we translated, which is about 1.75 million pages 13 years ago. And that number gradually has been increasing over the years to the 2.35 million that we translated last year. So our workload is increasing. We're translating more pages as translators in the translation service. But this red dotted line here shows staff numbers. 12 years ago, they were nearly 2,500 staff, and now we're just under 2,000. So our staff numbers are going down, but the number of pages that we have to translate is going up. So that is one of the imperatives towards using more technology to help us do our work. I've got a couple more charts, and then we'll be through those. But this next chart takes the 2.35 million pages that we translated last year and breaks them down into target language. So we have 24 official languages in the EU, and that means we have 24 language departments in DG translation. And this is how much of that 2.35 million those departments did last year. So it's broken down. So you can imagine these columns as physical piles of paper that contribute to that 2.35 million. And if you look at on the left-hand side there, and at the bottom you have the language codes. So these are, we translated more pages into French last year than into any other language. The next one is German. I don't know whether on your screens you're going to be able to see such fine detail as to see the language codes. But then if you look, then more or less all the other language departments are producing more or less an identical number of pages, and there's a reason for that I'll come to. And then right at the end here, well, right at the very end, there's a small amount of pages translated into other languages. The vast bulk of our translation is between the languages of the EU, and English is still one of the 24 official languages of the EU. But English there is right at the bottom in terms of our output. So we produced fewer pages into English than any other EU language last year. Now, that is a radical change from how it previously was until just a few years ago. I dipped into an old presentation that I had from 10 years ago where the equivalent slide, I had the equivalent slide to this to see how many pages we were translating into English 10 years ago, and it's on the next slide, and you'll see, I mean, it looks slightly different, but essentially the same format, and the column on the left here is the column for English. So the amount of work that we were doing in 2015, around about 2 million pages, it was broken down like this, and we were translating far more of those pages into English than the other languages. So for most of the languages, we had 3 times as many pages to translate into English as we did the other languages, and that has collapsed over the last few years. The workload of the English language department, which is doing the translation into English, has fallen very considerably over the last period. Why is that? Well, it's the machine translation, the AI. It's this e-translation service which is open to for use by all of our customers internally in the European Commission as well as ourselves. To explain why it's happened for English and not the other languages, I have to explain a very fundamental difference in the translation service between English and all those other languages. One of the European Commission's jobs is, as I explained, to to propose new EU legislation. And when our policy officers are doing that, they almost exclusively now draft in English. So there isn't a job of translating that document into English. But because all of those legislative proposals have to appear in all the languages of the EU, the other language departments, the other 23 language departments, their main role is taking that draft legislation that's drafted in English and turning it into their language so that it can be published for the public to be able to see it. And that workload hasn't changed really. The work of the English language department is actually very, very different. Our work is involved with translating the correspondence that comes in from the governments of the 27 member countries of the EU. So when EU legislation is adopted, these countries, the member states, have to apply the legislation, and there's a lots of reporting requirements connected to EU legislation. They have to write in and explain to the European Commission how they are applying EU legislation, and there's often lots of exchanges of correspondence to clarify matters and so on. And because the EU is a multilingual organization, those governments can write to the European Commission in any of the 24 official languages. And so they usually simply write in their own language. So if the Finnish government needs to send a big report to the European Commission, it will send it in Finnish. Now, it may be that the person in one of our policy departments who needs to read that report, it may be that they're unable to read Finnish, but they need to be able to read it to be able to digest the information and act on it. And it's at that point when they come to the translation service and say, can you translate this? And they can ask for it to be translated into English, French, or German, which are the 3 internal working languages in the Commission. But in practice, almost always, they ask for it to be translated into English. And that is the workload of the English translation department in our translation service. And it's very different to the other language departments. But because that policy officer now has access to this AI tool, e-translation, they don't have to send a 200-page report to us to find out what it's saying. They can run that report through e-translation, and they may find that they don't need, and that it's good enough for their purposes, and they don't need to have it translated, or they may find that actually just 10 pages of that document are what they need, and then they can send us 10 pages for translation and not 200. So that process, that new way of working, has led to a really large drop in the workload of the English language department in particular. So that's one of the ways in which AI is affecting translation and translators at the European Commission. When we're actually doing the translation, when they do send us translation to do, we have various tools that help us to do that. We've got IATE, which also has a public form, which is a terminology database, which many of you will know. We have EURLEX, which is also public. That's a multilingual catalogue of EU legislation. We use SDL Trados Studio as the basis of our CAT tool environment. We use, as translators, we use e-translation, or we're allowed to use e-translation. Not everybody does, but we can. We have something called Euramis, which is our database of translations going back more than 20 years, our corporate translation memory, which is, I think, probably the most useful tool that we have. We have various other tools that I won't go into, but we have traditional dictionaries, paper and online. We have style guides in the same way that newspapers and magazines have style guides. Just as an aside, just because this is probably predominantly a UK audience, translation services don't generally make the news very often, but I was made the UK news last month. DG Translation and the English department of DG Translation maintains something called an English style guide. Some of you will know it because that's also a public document, and it's intended for authors and for translators in the European Commission, with all kinds of guidance on how to handle all kinds of aspects of writing documents. I've taken this little on the right there, a little extract of the contents, and you might not be able to see, but point 15 there, there's a section on inclusive language, which has been there for a few years. And this style guide is updated every now and again. The last update was last month. There was no change to the inclusive language section of that style guide. So we were a little bemused when we saw that the Daily Telegraph had obviously been keeping an eye on the English style guide and ran a big news story on it. EU bans the word man in inclusive language guide. Politicians told to swap terms such as tradesman or man-made for alternatives. I don't have time to go into all the inaccuracies in this article, but we thought it was interesting that still there are some journalistic habits that die hard, even though the UK is now, for a long time, has no longer been a member of the EU. But it was quite interesting to see our work hit the headlines like that. Okay, I mentioned e-translation as being, I think that's the main AI tool that I, as a translator, and my colleagues really has an impact on our work. It's the machine translation system of the EU institutions. We're not allowed to use things like Google Translate or DeepL. Our documents are confidential at the point that we are translating them. So that's why we developed our own machine translation service. Also, our documents are quite specific to us in nature, and so we've developed our own machine translation to better deal with the kind of documents that we have to translate. Previously, it was a statistically based MT service, but the neural version launched 8 years ago and became very much better after that. It was developed internally by the European Commission and by the translation service in cooperation with what is known in our jargon as DG Connect, which is our digital services department. And it was co-financed by all the EU institutions and a program called Digital Europe. And how do we use it? Well, we can use it. It has a website interface that we have access to, but it's also integrated into lots of other IT applications and websites that are run by the European Commission. This is a page this is really intended for an internal audience, but EU translation is for use when human translation is not available, to get a rough translation for emails and so on, to see if a human translation is needed, as I explained before. And if you need perfect quality translation, we tell our colleagues to consult a professional translator, of course. This is how what the interface looks like when we go to it. You can translate a little bit like Google translate, you can just drop in snippets of text. It's in 32 languages now. You can also, and this is the way we use it, you can also just upload a file and upload a file here, and here you choose the languages, the output format, so you can have it in TMX format or the original format if that's PDF or Word. There's also, on the right hand side there's an option to upload glossaries. If you have single word glossaries, you can also upload those. That's quite a new feature. There's a section here called domain, which is set as a default to EU formal language. That's the type of document that you're dealing with, and most of our documents are in EU-related formal language, and so that's the domain that we usually set it to. But then on the bottom here, the bottom left, there's a tick box, and this only appeared just a few weeks ago. It's a new development. Neural machine translation, it's an older form of AI. I think some people even don't refer to it as a kind of artificial intelligence. It's certainly not the generative AI that has been the thing that's been hitting the headlines over the last couple of years. But there's a new feature in e-translation which is using generative AI to improve the output of the machine translation in e-translation. I haven't used it yet, so I can't vouch for how well it does. But it shows how the use of AI is increasingly filtering into our daily work. That EU formal domain that I said is based on Euramis, that database of our translated segments that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. It represents over 2 decades of translators' work. It now amounts to 2 billion sentences, and adding apparently 400,000 new ones every day that are going into our into our translation memory. And this really, that work of translators is what has underpinned the development of e-translation, but also the other AI tools that I'm going to mention briefly in a little bit. But one of the issues with using EU documents to train a machine translation engine means that there are little quirks that sometimes come up. So an example here is e-translation was asked to translate the sentence, "The chair was broken for the duration of the meeting." And now we would all know what a chair means in this case. However, a chair in the EU context, we have more chairs that do a different thing than the things that we sit on. And so until not too long ago, e-translation was translating that from English into the French. "Le président est cassé pour la durée de la réunion." Because chairs are people who are in charge of meetings in most of the time in EU context. And this morning I went to EU translation and I put that same sentence in to see if it had improved, because this example is from a couple of years ago. And actually, it's still not much better. So today, this morning, our e-translation engine was saying, "La présidence est interrompue pendant la durée de la réunion." So it's still, it can't handle the simple concept of a chair. So it has some weaknesses. But it's used in various ways, as well as us using it internally as translators. It's used for external websites. So this website run by the Commission's Trade Department. This is a screenshot showing you that e-translation is embedded into that, so that if people want to read it in French in this case, they can get an e-translated version of the website, where previously there wouldn't have been anything other than English. It's not that this is replacing some translation that would have been done by our translation service. There wouldn't be capacity to do it. So it's offering a French version where there wouldn't be one otherwise. And there are other pages that offer all 24 versions. and it comes with a disclaimer, of course. The use of e-translation has really expanded since 2017, 19 million pages then, and really growing a lot. Last year, 764 million pages it was used to translate, which is extraordinary, really. And that's pages used, sorry, that number of pages is people using it everywhere, not just inside the European Commission, but inside the European Commission, we did that 2.35, 2.4 pages of human translation that you saw earlier in the presentation. Many of those would have been used with the help of e-translation. But then 20 million, so almost 10 times as many pages were translated by colleagues outside the translation service. So they're the people that I explained earlier that are using e-translation to get a gist of the document before they decide whether they need to send it for translation. So we as translators use it, I use it. A few years ago, we did a little survey of translators in the English language department to see how it was used and attitudes to it. I'll go through that quickly. We had 106 staff translators then in 2021. We have 78 now. Of those that responded to the survey, 86% were using it at least occasionally. 50% more frequently for certain source languages, 46% more frequently for certain types of document. Of those that used it at least occasionally, 10% used it always. Sorry, 10% used it always. Most people said they used it frequently or occasionally, and 14% said they never use it. Most of those had tried it, and their main concerns were the impact on the quality of their translation, the impact on their translation speed. They said they got lower job satisfaction from it. I must say that it hasn't lowered my job satisfaction. It hasn't taken out the intellectual satisfaction that I get from working on translation jobs. 50% of people use it more frequently with certain source languages. In the English language department, we translate from 22 other languages, and we really do have to cover all those languages. So most of our translators are working from more than 2 languages, and very often people have learnt additional languages in-house and on the job, and our command of those languages sometimes can feel weaker. And Dom alluded to it in the introduction. I translate Estonian and Russian much more slowly than I translate French or Czech, for instance. And I find e-translation really very helpful in working through a text from those languages. So 2/3 people said they use e-translation more for their weaker languages. People said they use it more frequently for certain types of document. And we found that it's more useful for well-drafted texts, for texts that are similar to previous translations or closer to standard EU drafting style. What kind of benefits did people say they got from using machine translation, e-translation? 3/4 said it provides dictionary help, provides a gist, saves typing. 70% nearly said that. That's one of the big reasons I use it. It really saves me typing. Sometimes it can provide inspirational, useful solutions. I must admit, sometimes it comes up with something that's better than what I initially thought of. The way I use e-translation is I prefer to have a blank segment. At first, I like to look at the source, decide in my own head how I would translate it. And then if we don't have a match from the memory, introduce e-translation to see what it would offer. 40% said it allowed people to work faster and under time pressure. What are the drawbacks? People said that 60% said they make mistakes they wouldn't otherwise make. Translations sometimes become more literal. 60% of people said that. That people need to spend more time rereading their translations, but before they're given to a colleague for them to be revised. It may lead the translators to engage less with the source text, some people said. And the reasons for that are pretty well known by now. Many of you will have worked with machine translation and you will recognize these things. It can sound fluent but have significant errors. I've got a couple of examples coming up. Omissions and additions, incorrect, inconsistent terminology. But that last one, it allows translators to work faster under time pressure. DGT a few years ago asked Ghent University here in Belgium to do a study on our translators. 2018, they did a month-long study of translators in the French and Finnish departments to measure whether there were any speed gains by using e-translation. It was a small sample size, but all of the users were faster than they would have been without the e-translation. The average speed gain was 14% when working into Finnish and 12% working into French. I said I would bring some examples. I'll skip through these just to maybe gain some time. Here's a very recent example of a segment that came up from e-translation. You don't need to know the original Slovak to see the problem with a self-propelled non-track vehicle. And in fact, there are only two phrases in the original that mean, or that could be interpreted as self-propelled, but it has self-propelled 3 times in the translation. And that might be relatively trivial, you spot that straight away, but there are more serious examples. This is an example of a Czech text, which I've had to redact. It had some sensitive information, names of companies in it, but this significant drop in revenue cannot be explained by the above-mentioned price war, it said. And I had to make sure I was reading that original correctly because it was actually diametrically opposite. This significant drop in revenue cannot be explained by anything other than the above-mentioned price war. E-translation inexplicably missed that out. Sometimes there are more Orwellian examples. This is some text in English which appeared in a document that was otherwise in a different language, and e-translation didn't know how to deal with that. And this is what it came up with, which was very strange and confusing. 1984. And my last example is getting close to lunch, at least where I am in Brussels. This was a document that I had to translate about a Slovak dessert cake called Muranské buchty. And there they are. A lot of our translation work concerns EU legislation, which is about protecting the geographical indications of traditional food products. And this was a translation I was doing about this Slovak food product, which is called a Muránska buchta. And the buchta is this kind of, whatever you'd call it, a sort of a soft, sweet roll. And e-translation called it a buffle at one point. It called it a puzzle at another point. And in fact, it came up with lots and lots of different words for this item. And in fact, in our translations, we don't translate the item name. We leave it as it is. So it just remained in the translation as buchty. But Muranské is the adjectival form of a location. But these are what it came up with. Muranol drums, Muranos buch, Muran ribs, and then when it was used without the adjective in front of it, just as buchty, and then it came up with buffle and puzzle, as we've seen. Hammers was another thing it translated them as. The mullets, bouquets, buffet, buds, husk, and my favorite one, buoyancy. So this is a Slovak delicacy called a buoyancy. Very odd. But I mean, that's these are just some funny examples showing that where AI machine translation lets us down, and we have to make sure that there's a human always still behind the process. They're not going to be replacing us in our context anytime soon. But I showed earlier that the translation service is now offering more than just translation. And the translation service now is offering so-called AI-based multilingual services, e-translation and more. And these products are e-summary, e-briefing, and e-reply. A little bit more on a slide or two. They're available in all the EU languages plus other languages. And they're available not just within the European Commission to our internal customers, but they're available outside. They're available for public institutions in the EU, so public administrations, government bodies, and so on, in the EU and countries that are part of the Digital Europe program. They're also available to universities, to SMEs, to NGOs. So they're becoming more and more widely available outside the institutions as well. And the way our AI unit in the translation service puts it is that we've gone from providing translations to providing AI gold. So this work of translators over the last 20 odd years has allowed us to generate these tools. And people who go to the website to access these tools, this is what they see. And just to close up on the actual services themselves, e-briefing is a service in which you can generate a report from a set of documents if you need to brief a politician or a commissioner and so on. E-reply is a service in which we take a letter that's been received into the EU institutions, and e-reply can draft a reply to that letter. And then e-summary, summarizing long documents. And there are other things as well there, which I won't go into for time reasons. But it just shows that the Commission's translation service now has become a provider of much more than translation. It's become a provider of AI services internally. What future services are on the horizon from generative AI? AI is going to be applied to help to improve the accuracy and reliability of e-translation. The aim is not to replace it, but to scale it up. It's going to be applied to terminology extraction and management. It's going to help us with evaluating the translations that we have that are outsourced and that we have to evaluate, and also detecting semantically similar documents. If we have copies or near copies of documents, it's not always easy to detect those. We're going to use AI to detect those so that we don't have to retranslate them. So there may be new roles that emerge from this. Our translation service may soon have prompt engineers or prompt writers, as one of my colleagues said they might be better known as, to persuade people to take them on. I'm going to skip over that. We also have, we can't use ChatGPT internally. We've got an internal ChatGPT equivalent called GPT at EC. I asked it, what is the CIOL? And it came up with a pretty good answer. And that's it, more or less. We also have a program called the Translating Europe project. That's the European Commission's Translation Services outreach program, organizes conferences in EU countries, but also an annual Translating Europe forum in Brussels, in person and online. And it's open to everybody in Europe and beyond, so including the UK. I would encourage you to apply to attend that conference if you like. The last conference was in November, and it had a lot of AI-related content. And a lot of those talks are on DG Translation's YouTube page if you want more information on any of them. And our YouTube page is just one of the many avenues that you can contact us on. There's some more social media links. I'm going to skip over what our Director-General said at a recent conference, but it just illustrates how committed he and the translation service is to technology, but also to the translation profession and to the humans in it. And I'll end it there. My email address is there if you want to contact me and get any further information. So I have gone over time. Apologies for that.
Thank you so much, Paul. That was an absolutely fantastic presentation. Really, very, very interesting. We've had loads and loads of questions and comments come in, but unfortunately, we are, as you said, we're over time, and everyone's lost their break. But I'm sure nobody minded because that was just so interesting. So thank you once again for that presentation, Paul, and we will move